tonight. We're studying 1 Kings chapter 11, and we're also going to mention the book of the Song of Solomon. I haven't looked far enough ahead in our curriculum to see if we pick up on that again or not. As I mentioned before, we're trying to cover a set curriculum that'll, if everything goes as it should, get us through the entire Bible in 8 years. So I don't know if why is that funny? It is a long book, and it's only a 30-minute session, so. So I don't know if we're going to study it later on or not, or if this is the only mention of it that we'll have in our study. Some of these studies are going to be pretty condensed, but it does come into play here just a little bit, or I guess at least worth mentioning. And if you have your Bibles, turn over to the book of Song of Solomon. Keep your mark there in 1 Kings chapter 11. I'm going to read the first 3 verses here and then maybe talk a little bit about the significance of the book of Song of Solomon and how it fits into this particular story that we're going to study tonight. In 1 Kings chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, it said, "But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go in to them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart." So, does anybody, how many of you have ever studied the Song of Solomon in a Bible class? Yeah, that's how many times I've taught it. So if you studied it, it wasn't for me. It's not a book that we dedicate a lot of time or a lot of study to, but does anybody know right offhand what the book is about? Yeah, it's a love story, and of course, who wrote it? Now that's a no-brainer right there, right? The Song of Solomon. And what was special about this song? Look at verse 1. There's a statement there that's pretty important. Yeah, the Song of Songs. What does it mean when we read in the Bible the King of Kings? Greatest. It means the greatest, right? You can't get any higher. Solomon called this his Song of Songs. Now, does anybody remember how many songs Solomon wrote? How many proverbs? I better double check so I don't get them mixed up here. I think I know.
1,000, 3,000?
Yeah. I think one was 1,005 and the other one was 3,000. Let me double check here real quick. Yeah, 1 Kings 4:32 says he spake 3,000 proverbs and his songs were 1,005. So Solomon wrote 1,005 different songs, but he says this is the Song of Songs. This is the greatest song that he ever wrote. And basically, when you read the book, it follows what we would deem, or the Bible, we might categorize it into poetic language. And so it's really a love story, and it's before, I think it was written, and this is just kind of conjecture, we don't know for sure, but I think it was written probably before Solomon became entangled with so many women. And it was probably written, most people believe that it was written concerning his first wife. Who was his first wife?
Pharaoh's daughter.
Yeah, it was Pharaoh's daughter, right? If you look in verse 5, and here's part of the reason why, and a lot of times she's the kind of the main character, I guess you could say, in the book itself, and a lot of it is about things that she spoke to Solomon. But in verse 5, she says, "I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of cedar, as the curtains of Solomon." And then verse 6, "Look not upon me, because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept. And so, obviously, the Egyptians were of darker skin and could have fallen into that category. And so a lot of people believe that this was written about Pharaoh's daughter. And this was kind of what we might deem as, Solomon's true love. Solomon's first wife and really the true king of Israel. Now, remember what we're reading about in chapter 11, some things that took place later in the life of Solomon. We've already studied how it took 20 years for Solomon to build his house and to build the house of God, and then there was the 4 years of preparation. And does anybody know how long Solomon reigned? Yeah, about 40 years. And so we're over halfway into his reign, and I imagine this is probably more toward the end of his reign that some of these things took place that we're going to read about. But it's obviously, to Solomon, it was a very important song, wasn't it? He called it his greatest song that he ever wrote. And so it's a song about love. It's kind of a love story of he and this woman, how they met, how they went through the courtship period, how he asked her to marry him, how they went through that week, the week of celebration for the marriage feast, and then after that, some of the events of life that they enjoyed together. But it's really highly poetic language, and it's kind of important to emphasize, I think, here at the beginning of all this study. Yes, sir, Adam, you got a comment?
I have a question.
Okay.
It has a list here when you read 1 Kings chapter 11, first few verses. You're not supposed to marry these women. They'll turn your hearts from God. Was the Egyptian women going to be in it? Were they some of those they weren't supposed to marry as well?
The ones that are specifically forbidden were the Canaanites.
The surrounding nations.
Yeah, that they were driving out. And when you study, some of the other great leaders of God, intermarried with some of these other people. So I don't know. I don't have really strong convictions or feelings about it. I don't know that there's any one verse that points out or excludes marrying anybody from Egypt. But certainly, it seems to imply from the language that she's almost in that same category, doesn't it? In verse 1?
I guess that's what I'm asking. Did you have any wife that was right here?
That was legitimate? Well, he loved foreign women. That was the problem. And so that was kind of, that was what consumed Solomon. That's what ultimately led to his downfall, was this love that he had for these foreign women. And so he wasn't shy about marrying them. But it seems like, when you read verse 1 there, it seems like she's kind of in that same list, as all these other people that the Lord had told them not to intermarry with. So we do know, like we said, though, when we read here in Song of Solomon, that this was not an Israelite woman that he was writing about because of the color of her skin. So that tells us a little bit of the insight. But I think you think about Solomon and how many women did he have married? Yeah, 1,000. And I mean, stop and think about that for a minute. Why would a man marry 1,000 women?
Well, he wasn't married to all of them, was he? Was he married to all of them?
Yeah, some of them were his concubines. He had 700 wives that were considered princesses. And then you had kind of in that culture, we've talked about the concubine was kind of the servant of the wife, and a lot of times they married them too. So evidently they fell into that pool. But do you think all of those, the point that I'm trying to make is, do you think all those marriages were based upon love? No, I don't think all of them. Solomon had the same feelings toward all those women that he expresses here in the Song of Solomon toward this one woman, toward this true love that he had. And so a lot of those marriages, they probably weren't what we would consider romantic relationships or loving relationships, but what did they have to do with?
Power.
Yeah, possessions and power. And so a lot of them were alliances that were formed with other nations. A lot of them were to, kind of seal a treaty or a compact or things like that. And it's kind of interesting to just think about, Solomon married all these women. 1,000 women. I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? It wasn't based upon his love, but he did. The Bible said he did love many foreign women. So there were a lot of those women that he did marry. I think that he had deep feelings toward, but not all of them. Okay, so to kind of put that in perspective, maybe again, the Song of Solomon, it's a book about love. That's what it's about. And Solomon's relationship with his wife and his true feelings toward her.
You know, just think about Solomon. He was a man of excess. I mean, he had the most of everything. The wealthiest, had the biggest, most beautiful homes, the most beautiful palace, wisest man in the world. He was more than anybody. So why not have more wives than anybody else too?
Yeah, but 1,000?
You put that in perspective, you realize if you spent a day on each woman, it would take him 3 years to look around the first one. 1 year.
Yeah.
3 years, he married 21,000.
Yeah. So
Every year.
yeah, so it gives you a little bit of a perspective. But like Daryl said, that was kind of his forte, wasn't it? I mean, that's how he operated. He did everything to the umpteenth degree. And well, when we get over to the book of Ecclesiastes, we'll see a little bit more of that mindset of Solomon. But just to kind of set the idea or the pace again, it wasn't the case that Solomon, was just madly in love with all these women. That's why he married them. But there were, some of these women that he truly did love. And I think we're reading about some of these women here in 1 Kings chapter 11. So question number 2 is, and this is, again, kind of set the stage for what we're reading and studying tonight, what potential problems of a marriage, or what are the potential problems of a marriage between two people of different faiths? That's what we're reading about tonight, aren't we? We're reading about Solomon, who had this strong conviction to serve God and worship Him, and then we're reading about these women that he married that were devoted to worshiping other gods. And so they had two different systems of faith here. So what are some of the potential problems of that? Can you maybe see anything in that?
Well, if you had different values or different beliefs, you'd have different values
Yeah.
about what life is all should be like. And it would be very hard to, it's hard enough just with one person in a relationship, when two people in a relationship don't agree. But you complicate that with 1,000 or 750 or whatever it is, and it would just be overwhelming, even to the most wisest person in the world.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, you bring up a good idea or thought process, and that has to do with values. Spiritually speaking, life values, would be different. Moral values are going to vary in these different relationships that Solomon formed with these women. And so what does that create? When two people are operating on two different value systems, what's that going to create? Conflict, right? Just natural. There's going to be disagreement. There's going to be conflict in what is right and what is wrong, and which direction a person should go. Yes, sir.
We have conflict in marriages when you are of the same faith because you interpret things differently than maybe your spouse does. So then you have this conflict anyway. I can't imagine when you already geared towards something completely different, and the two of you are trying to figure it out.
Yeah, so it'd be a very difficult situation for everybody to get along in, right?
I don't know if Solomon had a lot of conflict with his women, because if you read this stuff, he never said no. Do you want a temple to whatever? I'll build you a temple to whatever. I think the conflict came between him and God.
Yeah.
Because he never told these women no that I can see. You want to do that? We'll do it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
It's not just that he said yes, he supported with
Right.
his means. Sure,
Yeah.
I'll build you this whatever.
Yeah, and that's what ultimately led to his downfall. Was that compromise that he was willing to make with these people. But the point that I really want for us to think about and to see from this, it's because he loved them so much that he did this, right? It's because he cared about them. Let's just put it that way. You know, it wasn't that he just married these women and didn't have any feelings for them. He loved them, and because of that love that he had for them, his love for them was stronger than his love for God. And that's not a good formula whenever we think about, you know, what it takes to please Jehovah God. And so he had to compromise his value system. And that's really what I think Adam's talking about there. You know, he had to compromise his moral values, his priority values, things that took him away from truly worshiping God.
Well, and my thought was kind of along the same line. You have spouses that are different faith. I think, generally speaking, one is going to sway the other one way or another, because they're not going to go separate ways on their faith. I mean, there's a few that I know of have, but mostly it's going one way or another.
Yeah.
Either the husband's going to sway the wife to their faith, or the wife's going to sway the husband.
Yeah, and if they are able, like you said, that's not true necessarily in every case, but if they are able to maintain their own value system, there's going to be conflict because of it. You know, that's going to be the result of it. That's just the way that it is. So, you know, you mentioned the idea, and Paul mentioned that idea too, the unequal yoke between the believer and the unbeliever, 2 Corinthians 6:15. And he didn't necessarily write that about marriage. That's really any unequal yoke. But it's the idea of one person being stronger than the other and pulling them to the wrong side. And so as a Christian, we can't form a relationship in which a person is going to pull us away from God. Their pull on us is stronger than our pull on them. And so, again, a lot of times that's pulling back and forth, doesn't it? I mean, again, it involves the idea of struggle or conflict. Yes, sir.
The biggest problem with power and money is losing your self-control or control yourself. And you're the man, he's the wisest man in the world. He's got an incredible amount of power, he's got everything he wants. He loses all self-control.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last thing that I have written down here about the potential problems is what happens when you have children? Okay, yeah, usually they're caught in the middle, aren't they, somewhere? You know, mom tries to pull them this way, dad tries to pull them this way. And so it's again, it creates conflict within the family unit itself. So, you know, I emphasize this when I always talk about it. The Bible doesn't teach that it's a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. That would be there would have to be a law where God said don't do this for it to be a sin. But it certainly at the very least teaches it to be unwise, doesn't it? And so that's something that of course most of us in here have already walked down that road, but something that we need to instill those values into our children and into our grandchildren. And so it created problems for Solomon, didn't it? And Solomon was the wisest man in the world. He wasn't smart enough to figure out how to make those relationships work. I don't think we're going to do any better than Solomon did, but certainly the Bible questions the wisdom of such actions. Okay, let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 11 here, and we'll get through what we can. This is a good chapter, a lot of discussion in it. If I can, get somebody to read the first 10 verses for us. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 10.
A lot of big words in that.
The first three verses again, Clint, or?
It don't matter. We can skip. Let's start in verse 4.
For it came to pass when Solomon was old, and that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord as David his father. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, and an abomination of Moab, and a hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice. And he commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he kept not that which the Lord commanded.
Okay, so question number 3 on your sheet is what was one of Solomon's primary downfalls, and one of those areas where his disobedience against God was obvious?
Well, women.
Yeah, his marriage to foreign women, right? And again, that's really what I think is emphasized there. If you look in, let's see, verse 1 of chapter 11, it says, "But King Solomon loved many strange women," many foreign women. That was his affinity. And so he had a weakness for these foreign women. He became, as he grew older, I guess you could say he became very physically minded, very easily attracted to these women. And a couple of things that were wrong with that. First of all, Deuteronomy 17, let's see, Deuteronomy 17, and let me get this one right. Sometimes my memory's not too good. Deuteronomy 17, and beginning in verse 1, God talks about how the children of Israel weren't to go and to sacrifice to other people. In verse 17, he made this statement. He's talking about the king here. This was the law for the king of Israel. "Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away." Now that's an interesting statement, because that statement has nothing to do with foreign women, right? What was the commandment? Yeah, don't have lots of wives. Why?
So turn your heart away.
Okay, so what does that mean?
I think you'd be more concerned with pleasing the women than you are with pleasing God.
Yeah, marriage is a relationship where spouses are supposed to try to please one another, right? And so as a husband, I have a desire to please my wife. Now, imagine if I had 1,000 wives. What would that do with my time? That's a lot of work and a lot of pleasing to do, right? And that was one of the commandments that God gave to the king. Don't multiply wives, or your heart's going to be turned away from me. In other words, your heart is going to be so focused on pleasing your wives that you're going to ignore my law, and you're not going to have time to do the things that I want you to do. Also, back in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, in beginning about verse 1, he talks about the 7 nations that they were to conquer when they went into the land of Canaan. And of course, they weren't supposed to make any covenant with them. In verse 3, he says, "Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter shall not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son." And here's why, verse 4, "For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods." So, 2 things really specifically, that are mentioned there. That is, don't multiply wives, because your heart's going to be, not going to be fully devoted to God like it needs to be. And don't intermarry with these foreign nations, because they're going to take you away from serving Jehovah God. Well, is that the story of Solomon? I mean, that's it to a T, isn't it? He loved these women. He tried to please them. And by trying to please them, one of the things that he did is built these places to worship all these other idols, because those were the gods that his wives worshiped. Okay, so number 4, what happened to Solomon's devotion to God as he got older? Yes?
What was that first reference in Deuteronomy?
Deuteronomy 17, I think 17. Yes, 17.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so what happened to his devotion to God as Solomon got older? Yeah, his heart turned away, right? Did his faith get stronger? No. Did his walk with God get closer as he grew older? No, it did the opposite. He turned away his heart from following the Lord. And so he wasn't completely devoted to God. He wasn't wholeheartedly following God. Number 5, how did the condition of Solomon's heart differ from David before him? What does it say about David?
David's heart was loyal, and he what is that? He was like God's own heart, or what is that quote?
Yeah, and so it's interesting in verse 4, it says that his heart, talking about Solomon, was not perfect with the Lord his God. And then in verse 6, it says, Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. So David's heart was perfect with God, which means what?
He was on purpose in his life.
Yeah, he fully followed God, didn't he? David, with all of his heart, followed the will of God. Solomon did not. Solomon's heart turned away from God. He went to trying to please these women that he had married instead of worrying about being pleasing to God. And so when you read all that, it's kind of interesting too. Man, I wish we had a lot more time. But 2 Kings chapter 23. We're reading in 2 Kings chapter 23, you read about Josiah. Of course, Josiah was one of the good kings of Israel. He came about 300 years after Solomon. And Josiah is trying to reform Israel. They're doing what's wrong. He's trying to get everybody to turn back and do what's right. We read about how Solomon built these places of worship for all these other gods. And when we look down, let's see, chapter 23, 2 Kings 23, and verse 13, here's what it says. This is Josiah reforming. And the high places that were before Jerusalem, which were on the right hand of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel had builded for Ashtaroth, the abomination of the Zidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, and for Milcom, the abomination of the children of Israel, did the king defile. And he brake in pieces the images and cut down the groves and filled their places with the bones of men. So 300 years later, these places that Solomon built are still there. And they're still being used to worship these idols. Israel is still using them to worship these idols. Josiah takes those places and utterly destroys them. So you have this situation where, the desire of Solomon to please his wife has turned away his heart from God. But what did it also do to Israel?
Their heart.
Yeah, he contributed it to their hearts being turned away from God too by building these places and allowing people to worship there. And again, for 300 years, that went on, and that was part of the downfall of Israel. And so what that does is, to me, it kind of, it kind of gives you a picture of why God is so angry with him. Well, let's do number 6 here. What reason did God have to be especially angry with Solomon? Okay, he started following other gods. There's a couple of things that are mentioned here in verses 9 and 10, though.
He came to him twice.
Yeah. How many times had God appeared to Solomon? Well, twice, personally, he came to Solomon, right? He came to him in a dream. And what did he tell him? Verse 10.
He commanded him concerning this very thing, that you should have no other gods.
Yeah. So, in 2 dreams, God personally appeared to Solomon and he warned him about this very thing, didn't he? He said, don't go after these other gods. Don't go after them, worshiping them, or, again, I'm going to bring punishment down upon you. And so the behavior of Solomon in the eyes of God was inexcusable, right? Because God had personally warned him. What else could you do? How stronger could you get? God had personally appeared to him and warned him about this very thing twice. And anybody who has kids, if you've ever warned your kids about something specifically and they turn around and do it, how do you feel about that? What if you warned them twice about it? You can understand, right? God's reaction in this case. Question 7: Why isn't a word from God or divine intervention any guarantee against man's sin? Why didn't that guarantee that Solomon wasn't going to do it?
Because he didn't listen.
Yeah, he's a free moral agent, right? All of us have a personal choice. And the morals of Solomon declined for one reason. What was that reason?
His eyes off God.
Well, yeah, it was his evil associations, wasn't it? It was these intermarriages with these women that led his heart away from God. I couldn't help but think of 1 Corinthians 15:33. Be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners. Did it happen in Solomon's place? Absolutely. And that's a powerful verse, and I think one that we probably don't think about enough, and one that we don't emphasize to our children enough either. But if Solomon, the smartest man in the world, wasn't able to overcome evil associations, there's a great lesson for us in that. Verses 11 through 13, we're about out of time already, but verses 11 through 13, God pronounces his judgment upon Solomon. And what was that judgment?
He would take his kingdom away.
Yeah, he would take his kingdom away and he would give it to who? One of his servants, right? Would he take all of it away? Yeah, he said, because of David, not because of Solomon, but he said, because of your father, because of David, I'm not going to do this in your lifetime, but I'll do it in your son's lifetime. In other words, Solomon was going to allow to remain to be king over Israel. But he said, because of David, I'm going to leave your son one tribe. If it hadn't been for David, everything would have been taken away from Solomon and his lineage. Why did God leave it? What was the promise he made to David? Remember?
That someone from his lineage would always be on the throne.
Yeah, somebody from his lineage was going to be an eternal king, right? Was going to sit on the throne forever. And so, for that reason, God said, I'm going to leave you one tribe. I'm going to give 10 of them away to your servant, but I'm going to leave you one. And all that was, again, because of David. We read about the history of this first enemy. You know, because of Solomon's disobedience, there were certain enemies that came into the picture. Hadad was one of those we read about. Rezon was another one. You can read a little bit about their history. It doesn't really give a lot of details as to how they tormented Solomon in his reign, but they were a constant thorn in his side during his reign because of his disobedience to God. And then, of course, you have Jeroboam, and Jeroboam was a man who Solomon had appointed as I guess, supervisor over all the laborers of the tribe of Manasseh and what's the other tribe I'm looking for? Ephraim. Manasseh and Ephraim. And so he kind of gained popularity, and eventually he rebels against Solomon. Because of that, Solomon tries to kill him. And so Jeroboam runs down and hides in Egypt until the time comes for him to be king. So Solomon reigns 40 years over Israel, and that's kind of the